Matthew, good to have you with us. How much of a surprise was this attack and then the resulting riots?
Well, I think the attack itself was a surprise. I mean, the nature of the attack was desperately sad. So I don't think really anybody was expecting something like that to happen. There didn't seem to be any indications that anything like that would happen.
Interesting. So what then did you make? Well, perhaps let's talk about that for a moment. What do you think fueled that attack in the first instance?
So, I mean, I can't speak to the attack itself. The kind of the disorder we saw afterwards. The trigger for that obviously was the stabbing, was the kind of the immediate sense of anger. But it's important to understand that triggers for riots are not the same as the broader conditions that can kind of lead to the riots. So when we look at the broader conditions, riots tend to be an expression of deeper anger, frustration, and a sense of powerless. It's the triggers that set it off. But there's usually reasons, for those things to happen in the first place. What we saw was the far right able to organize these things relatively quickly. So there was clearly use of social media and so on. But the conditions themselves that gave rise to the unrest, or at least catalyzed the unrest, are a set of very complex economic, social, and political conditions. It's important to say they're not unique to Ireland, but we have seen pressures such as an increasing cost of living crisis, housing pressures, which were uniquely difficult in Dublin and Ireland more generally, and quite a rapidly increasing inequality in some areas. And this can lead to people from all different backgrounds feeling a lack of control over their own lives, making ends meet, paying the rent, fears over job security, and particularly in more urban areas, a kind of sense of fear that communities where they've been rooted for perhaps generations, they may kind of have to move out because they cannot afford to live there anymore. These lead to much more generalized senses of fear, and this is something that the far right, historically has been very adept at exploiting, particularly then demonizing vulnerable groups, trying to provide very simple narratives of what are very complex problems.
Yeah. And would it be wrong? I mean, some officials have disregarded the group that were involved in the riots as just a simple lunatic fringe group. Would that be a mistake to see it as just a very isolated and contained situation?
I mean, again, it's quite complex. I think it's important to say that whereas we see a rise in the far right across Europe, particularly with the far right's electoral prospects, in Ireland, the far right is still a relatively small group. It's become more organized, particularly since the pandemic, where the use of social media was very important, particularly kind of spreading narratives around anti-vaccine conspiracies, spreading an anti-status narrative, particularly around lockdowns and public health measures. But they've pivoted back now to, I suppose, more traditional targets for the far right being the vulnerable groups, such as migrants. We don't have any electoral representation in the Oireachtas, which is the Irish Houses of Parliament here. But it's fair to say, I think, that the far right's become a lot more organised, even though it remains a relatively small group in the country.
Yeah. It's not isolated to Ireland. We're seeing similar rises in extremism in Europe too, where similar pressures, economic pressures, are rising, and also this sort of backlash against migrants. Is that a common theme?
We have seen this theme become more prominent. I think the real commonality that you touched upon is that across Europe we've seen an erosion of living standards, particularly I think since kind of the 2008 crash. I think countries are still recovering from that. It's been quite slow in some places. And the traditional social policy responses, so kind of the welfare state responses, the social services responses and so on, have been fairly slow to address these. So this is in part responsible for what we see now in terms of the erosion of living standards, the cost of living. Of course, we see the kind of the bounce back after the COVID pandemic. We have been told the war in Ukraine has also been responsible for some of these cost of living crises. But a lot of these can be addressed by effective social policies. And what we've really seen, really since kind of the mid-90s onwards, this subordination of social policy, so welfare policy, in favor of economic policy. So we've seen a real gearing of social policy really towards trying to sustain growth, sometimes to the detriment of these social services.
There was a rally, a solidarity rally in Dublin organised by the union movement, not necessarily a very large number, but a statement at least in terms of supporting the migrant community living there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we would expect to see these things. I think usually what happens after these really sad events is we see lots of support from the community. It depends on where the event is, the scale of the event, and how it affects the public consciousness. But we tend to see these expressions of solidarity, and it's not surprising that we see kind of the organised left and the trade union movement come out in solidarity of migrants. And it's an important show of solidarity that Ireland is open for everybody. It's important to say as well that in the immediate aftermath we saw the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar and other government figures kind of reaffirm Ireland's support of migrants and diversity, and I expect we'll see that more in the future.
Good to have you on. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much.